I am a police officer in San Antonio, Texas. I have been patrolling the streets of the city for more than 10 years, seeing all kinds of things. Accidents, crimes, people on the edge of despair. But nothing, not even the most brutal experiences, prepared me for what I lived that night. What happened in the cemetery torments me to this day. It was close to midnight when the call came over the radio. The dispatcher's voice sounded muffled, almost in a murmur that made me nervous from the beginning. He said that a neighbor who lived near the local cemetery had heard children's laughter and strange noises as if someone was moving the tombstones, a possible act of vandalism. My partner, Officer Rodriguez, and I were ordered to investigate. The night was cold, with a suffocating humidity that seemed to stick to the skin. It was not common for us to be called for something like that, and that already made me suspect that that night would not be like any other. The San Antonio Cemetery is more than a century old, an old and quiet place away from the city, surrounded by dark and tall trees that cast threatening shadows in the light of the street lamps. We approached slowly in the patrol car, illuminating the road with the headlights. The fog swirled like a whitish blanket, blurring the shapes and creating a feeling of absolute isolation. We got out of the car and prepared to walk the area. The feeling was disturbing, a deep silence broken only by the crunch of the gravel under our boots. We walked for several minutes, advancing into the darkness, illuminating with our flashlights the ancient monuments and the statues corroded by time. Murti tried to joke to lighten the atmosphere, but I couldn't laugh. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, I saw something move in the distance between the tombstones. A small figure, a white lump that seemed to float. "Did you see that?" I asked in a low voice, but Rodriguez didn't answer. I pointed my flashlight towards the place where I had seen the figure, and my heart stopped. For a second, there between the tombstones, was a girl no more than 7 years old with a white dress and dark hair that fell in messy locks over her face. She didn't look at me. She just played spinning on herself, laughing silently while her feet barely touched the ground. I took a step forward with my heart pounding in my chest. The girl ignored me, keeping spinning until I got close enough. Suddenly, she stopped dead, as if she had heard something. She raised her head slowly, looking me straight in the eyes, and I could see the sadness in her gaze, a deep sorrow that sank into my soul. Then, before I could do or say anything, she disappeared into the fog. A wind ice cream hit my face, and the feeling of emptiness it left was overwhelming, as if something important had been taken away. I screamed, turning towards him, but my partner was not there. I began to look for him, frantically pointing my flashlight in all directions. The trees seemed to bend over me threateningly, and the fog was getting thicker and thicker. Finally, I found Rodriguez standing in front of an old grave, staring at the tombstone as if he were hypnotized. I called out to him, but he didn't answer. I approached him, shaking him by the shoulder until he finally reacted, blinking as if he had woken up from a trance. "What's wrong?" I asked him, but he just pointed at the tombstone, trembling. The flashlight illuminated a blurry black and white photograph, that of a little girl in the same white dress that I had just seen. Below it was the name and date of death, October 1978. I felt a shiver run through my body. It was the same girl that I had just seen, the same one that had disappeared into the fog. The image seemed unreal to me, but I knew that I was not dreaming. Panic began to take hold of me. From that moment on, everything got worse. A child's laugh broke the silence, soft and barely audible, but clear enough for me to freeze my blood. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, as if the fog itself was generating it. I looked at Rodriguez, and his face was white, his eyes wide open. Without saying a word, we began to walk, moving quickly between the tombstones, looking for the exit. The flashlight trembled in my hands, and the air seemed to become heavier and heavier, making it difficult to breathe. Then something began to whisper my name, a low, persistent sound that slipped into the darkness, repeating my name over and over again. It was impossible to identify where it came from, but it was unmistakable. "Come on, let's go," I yelled at Rodriguez, but he suddenly stopped, looking towards a dark crypt. "What are you doing? We have to go." but he didn't move. He seemed magnetized by something I couldn't see. I decided to approach, dragging him by the sleeve. But as soon as I touched him, the door of the crypt opened with a deafening creak. I don't know what prompted me to enter. Maybe it was the need to end it once and for all. But I did, and Rodriguez followed me in silence, his empty face devoid of expression. Inside, the air was frozen, impregnated with a smell of wet earth and decomposition. The sound of water drops echoed in the gloom, each one like a heartbeat of something dark and alive. The flashlight illuminated the mosaic walls covered with names carved decades ago, perhaps centuries. At the end of the hall, I saw something move, a hunched figure trembling, that seemed to cry. I advanced slowly, each step an ordeal. And then I saw her. It was the girl, the same one from the cemetery. Her back was turned, her shoulders shaken by silent sobs. I felt a pang of compassion, but when I reached out my hand towards her, she turned around suddenly. Her face was not that of a girl, but a mask distorted by hatred and suffering, with her mouth open in a scream that made no sound. The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into absolute darkness. The minutes that followed were a nightmare. I don't know how we got out of the crypt, but I remember running blindly through the cemetery, stumbling over the tombstones, feeling invisible hands that seemed to try to stop me. The voices kept calling me, whispering my name in a spectral chorus that mixed with the wind. We finally arrived at the patrol car and left, shot from there without looking back. That night didn't end when we left the cemetery. Things started happening in my house. Noises in the night, doors that closed by themselves, shadows that moved in the corner of my eye. I always felt a presence, something I couldn't see, but I knew it was there, watching me. A month later, Rodriguez committed suicide. He didn't leave any note, but in his house, they found drawings of a girl in a white dress on all the walls of his room. I couldn't help but remember his expressionless face that night in front of the crypt. Since then, I have searched for information about the girl. It seems that she died in strange circumstances in 1978, but the details are confusing, lost in rumors and poorly kept files. Some say she was murdered, others that she drowned in an abandoned well near the cemetery. The only thing certain is that I have not been the same. The nights are long and sleep, when it comes, is always restless. Sometimes I still hear his soft and distant laugh, like an echo in my mind. No matter what I do, I know he will never leave me alone. The last time I went to the cemetery, I did it during the day, with the hope of putting an end to all this. I brought flowers to the girl's grave and said a prayer. I stood there, waiting until the sun began to set. Then I felt it again, that intense cold, that emptiness. I left before the darkness covered everything. But as I turned towards the exit, I saw his figure once again, between the shadows of the trees. He was smiling. Now I know that he is there, waiting for me, and that someday I will have to return. Every time I go out on patrol, I remember that night, and I look in the rearview mirror, hoping to never see that childish figure in the back of the patrol car again. But there is something that terrifies me even more. Sometimes, when the radio goes silent, I hear a broken whisper saying my name in a voice that does not belong to this world. There is no worse terror than the one you cannot escape because it stays with you inside, no matter where you go. The nights on patrol are filled with a terror that clings to my skin like the fog that rolls through the cemetery. Every time I step out of the car, I feel her presence, as if her spirit is reaching out from beyond the grave. The girl in the white dress has become more than a ghost story. It's a curse that I carry with me. I've tried to find answers, to understand what happened that night and why she has chosen me. The local archives offer little help. The girl's story is shrouded in mystery, with only fragments of truth scattered among the rumors. Some say she was a victim of a tragic accident, while others whisper of a darker force at play. The more I dig, the more I realize that the truth is buried deep, perhaps lost to history. Despite the passage of time, the cemetery remains a place of unease. I avoid it when on duty, but sometimes my route takes me close, and I can't help but look over, half expecting to see her figure standing among the tombstones. The site of the old crypt, where we last encountered her, sends a chill down my spine. My partner's suicide was a stark reminder of the toll this case has taken. His loss was a heavy blow, and I couldn't help but feel responsible. The drawings of the girl in his home were a chilling testament to the grip she had on him. Now, alone with my thoughts and haunted by the memories, I continue my patrols, always looking over my shoulder, always listening for the sound of the radio going silent, and always dreading the whisper that follows. Once upon a time, in December, we were patrolling a quiet night in the modern colonia of Guadalajara. We were passing through a very popular and busy area when we received a call about a suspicious truck. Upon arrival, we found a man, around 60 years old, who became very nervous upon seeing us. Though cooperative, he didn't refuse to show us the truck, which apparently transported meat due to the blood and meat residues throughout the box. At first, we didn't find anything, but the man grew increasingly nervous. I began to pressure him with questions, and without much prodding, he showed us the false floor of the box, revealing several skinless animal corpses. I almost vomited at the sinister discovery. When I asked him the purpose of loading those bodies, he confessed they were orders from people dedicated to witchcraft. Before leaving, he wrote down an address on a sheet, explaining that I could find out more there. At first, I didn't give it much importance, but the address began to haunt my mind. Unhealthy curiosity took over me, and after my shift, I decided to investigate on my own, despite knowing it was a stupid decision. The address led me to a crumbling neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. I found the house easily. It was old and gloomy, surrounded by a high, rusty iron fence. I approached cautiously and, finding the door unlocked, entered the house. The walls were covered with strange symbols and grotesque drawings, and a rotten flesh smell permeated the air. I advanced with my flashlight, exploring every corner until I found a ladder leading to a basement filled with altars and ritual objects, including more skinned animal carcasses. In a small room at the back, I found a human body under a sheet. As I lifted the sheet, I discovered the corpse had no skin, like the animals in the van. At that moment, I heard a noise behind me, but no one was there. The cold in the room intensified, and I felt an evil presence. I backed away, and when I returned to the basement, the door I had entered through was now closed. I tried to open it, but it was jammed. Panic set in as I remembered the police number and took out my cell phone, but there was no signal. Desperation made me think of my partner, but he didn't come. I heard a whisper behind me and saw a dark figure in a corner of the basement. The figure was humanoid but faceless, seeming to be made of shadows. It approached, and with each step, the cold increased. I tried to move, but fear paralyzed me. The figure stopped in front of me, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest as if something invisible was scratching my soul. Just as I felt like I was going to lose consciousness, the basement door slammed open, and the figure disappeared. My partner ran in, and we left the basement. I was in shock, unable to explain what had happened. We returned to the police station, and although my superior was skeptical, he promised to investigate the house. But when we returned, the house was empty, with no trace of the altars, animal corpses, or the desoid body. It was as if it had all been a bad dream, except for the marks on my chest, which doctors couldn't explain. I was given a temporary leave to recover, but the sleepless nights and memories of the dark figure did not leave me in peace. I knew there was something more in that house, something we could not understand or face. Time passed, and although I tried to return to normal, I always felt that something was stalking me. The nightmares were constant, and in each one of them, the shadow figure was present, watching me, waiting. Finally, I decided to leave the police, unable to continue facing the danger knowing that there was something beyond the physical, something I could not fight with a gun or a badge. I moved out of town, trying to escape the memories, but the shadows followed me. No matter where I was, I always felt that presence. I lived in constant fear, knowing that one day I would have to face that entity again. One night, while I was trying to sleep, I felt the cold again and saw the shadow figure at the foot of my bed. There was no escape this time. I knew it had come for me to take me to a place of eternal darkness. As the cold enveloped me and my vision faded, I knew my fate was sealed. The last vision I had was of his face finally revealed, an endless abyss filled with terror and despair. Life was never the same after that night in the basement. Although I had left the police force and moved out of town, the darkness and fear followed me like a constant shadow. My mental health began to deteriorate with sleepless nights and days filled with paranoia. I felt like something was always stalking me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I looked into therapies and medicine, but nothing seemed to work. The shadow figure I had seen in the basement became an obsession. I would spend hours researching supernatural entities, demons, and occult practices, trying to find an explanation or a solution. But the deeper I dug, the darker and more disturbing the information became. One night, while reviewing ancient occult texts, I found a reference to an entity known as the Guardian of the Shadows, a figure that feeds on human fear and despair. According to legends, once someone is marked by the Guardian, their soul is condemned to be consumed by darkness. The texts mentioned rituals and sacrifices that could appease the entity, but they were dangerous and required deep knowledge of black magic. Desperate, I decided I had nothing to lose and contacted a woman who claimed to be an expert in occultism and witchcraft. She lived in an isolated cabin in the woods, and upon arrival, she greeted me with a look that reflected centuries of wisdom and darkness. I explained my situation, and she agreed to help me. She warned me of a clearing in the woods where she had prepared a circle of protection with black candles and ancient symbols. She explained that I had to face the Guardian of the Shadows and offer my greatest fear as a sacrifice. If I managed to overcome the fear, the entity would withdraw, at least for a while. I sat in the center of the circle, surrounded by the heat of the candles and the whisper of the wind. I closed my eyes and began to recite the words that the woman had taught me. I felt a cold and dark presence approaching, and when I opened my eyes, there he was, the Guardian of the Shadows, looking at me with his empty eyes full of evil. Fear paralyzed me, but I remembered the words of the woman. I had to face my greatest fear. I closed my eyes again and thought of everything I had lost in my life, destroyed by fear and darkness. I offered my despair, my pain, and my deepest fear. I felt an invisible force pulling at my soul as if it wanted to tear it from my body. I screamed with all my strength, fighting against the darkness that tried to consume my being. I felt that I was on the verge of death, but something inside me, a spark of hope and courage, allowed me to continue fighting. Finally, the cold began to fade, and the shadow figure retreated until it disappeared completely. When I opened my eyes, I was alone in the clearing of the forest. The candles had burned out, and the silence was absolute. I got up with difficulty and returned to the woman's cabin. She greeted me with a tired smile, saying that I had achieved the impossible, but warned me that the Guardian of the Shadow would always be lurking, waiting for the moment of my weakness to return. I returned to the city trying to rebuild my life. Although the fear never completely disappeared, I learned to live with it by facing it. Every day, I knew that the darkness would always be near, but I also knew that I had the strength to resist. So, every night as I patrolled the dark streets of my new life, I remembered the most important lesson. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to face it and move forward, no matter how dark the road. My name is Francisco, and I am a police officer in a small town that lies hidden between the mountains and the thick forests of the north. Throughout my career, I have seen things that defy understanding, but none as disturbing and horrifying as what I witnessed on a cold October night during a night patrol shift. That experience is embedded in my memory like an indelible scar, and although my colleagues were also there, I was the only one who lived to tell the tale. Our unit was made up of 4 officers. Antonio, the veteran with more than 20 years of service. Marta, a brave and perceptive young woman who had only been in the force for 5 years. Luis, a robust and quiet guy but always willing to help. And me, Francisco, the most experienced on the night shift. That night, we were assigned to watch an area on the outskirts of town. a place where rarely anything worthy of mention happened, except for the rumors and legends that circulated among the inhabitants. Before the night began, like any other, we met at the station to check the equipment, drink coffee, and joke before going out to patrol. It was a ritual that gave us some peace of mind before facing the darkness. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and a thick fog enveloped the streets, creating a gloomy and oppressive atmosphere. We began the patrol around 10 at night, walking through the deserted streets and empty paths, doing our work meticulously but without expecting to find anything out of the ordinary. However, as the night progressed, a feeling of uneasiness began to invade us. We did not know exactly what it was, but something in the air felt different, as if an invisible shadow was watching us from the depths of the forest. It was around 2 in the morning when we received a call from the central office. An old woman who lived in an isolated house on the edge of the forest had reported strange noises and lights in the surroundings of her property. It was not the first time we had received similar calls, but given the disturbing atmosphere of the night, we decided to investigate. We arrived at the old woman's house, an old and deteriorated building surrounded by giant trees that seemed to murmur in the wind. The old woman, visibly scared, told us that she had seen hooded figures moving among the trees and that she heard strange chants coming from the forest. Although stories of sex and dark rituals were common in the region, we had never found any concrete proof of its existence. We split into pairs. Antonio and Marta stayed with the old woman to reassure her and secure the house, while Luis and I went into the forest to investigate. The fog was even thicker between the trees, and visibility was almost zero. We walked in silence, with our flashlights illuminating only a few meters in front of us. Every rustle of the leaves under our feet and every whisper of the wind put us on high alert. After walking for what seemed like hours, we came to a clearing in the middle of the forest, where we saw a circle of lit torches and a rudimentary altar made of stones and branches. Around the altar, a group of hooded figures moved in a hypnotic ritual, singing in a language that none of us recognized. The scene seemed taken from a nightmare. I felt a chill run down my spine and a feeling of imminent danger. I made a signal to Luis to stay back while I approached cautiously, trying to get a better view without being detected. It was then that I saw something that froze my blood. On the altar, there was a body of a young man who seemed to be unconscious or worse. The image was so shocking that for a moment, I was paralyzed. Suddenly, one of the hooded men raised his head and, without warning, shouted something out loud. The torches went out in unison, and the darkness completely enveloped us. In a matter of seconds, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and a sharp pain in my head. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the sound of chants and the macabre laughter of the hooded men. I woke up in an unknown place, tied hand and foot. The darkness was total, but I could hear the moans and whispers of other people around me. My head was shaking with pain, and a metallic taste invaded my mouth. I tried to move, but the bonds were too strong. Desperate, I tried to remember how I had gotten there, but everything was a blur. Hours or maybe days passed before someone entered the room. It was one of the hooded figures, holding a candle that illuminated his face in a sinister way. He looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and contempt before talking to me in a cold tone. He dispassionately told me that we had desecrated a sacred ritual and that we were now part of his offering to an ancient and powerful entity. His words were incoherent and terrifying, full of promises of torment. And so, they led me to the same clearing where we had found the altar. Lou was there. Antonio and Marta were also tied up and visibly beaten. However, they were not in sight. The hooded men resumed their ritual, and I could see them preparing a series of knives and strange tools next to the altar. I felt an indescribable desperation, knowing that there was no escape. Suddenly, a hooded man who seemed to be the leader of the group approached me with one of the knives in his hand. He began to recite a series of words in that unknown language. As he brought the knife closer to my skin, I felt a sharp pain and a wave of heat as the edge penetrated my flesh. The leader continued speaking as if he were in a trance, and the other members of the sect responded in chorus. In the midst of the pain and desperation, I heard a familiar sound, the roar of gunfire and the screams of men and women. The police had arrived. The hooded men scattered in panic, and in a matter of minutes, the officers took control of the place. I saw how Antonio and Marta, seriously injured, were rescued by our colleagues. Luis and I were untied and immediately taken to the hospital. Weeks passed before we could return to our lives. Although they were never the same again, the experience left us with physical and emotional scars that will never disappear. The sect, although dismantled by the police intervention, left a shadow of fear in the town. Despite the investigations, the true nature of its cult was never discovered, nor the identities of all its members. Antonio did not patrol at night again. Marta, although more determined than ever, also suffered recurring nightmares. Luis and I continued working, but with a prudence and a paranoia that we did not know before. The darkness of the forest and the whispers of the wind were never the same for us, and so my story ends. But the nightmare persists as a silent warning that there are things in this world that escape our understanding, and that some shadows should never be challenged. I am a police officer in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I have been in the force for almost 10 years now. I have patrolled the streets for countless nights, facing all kinds of situations from minor crimes to crimes that seem straight out of a movie. But never in my entire career have I experienced something that terrified me as much as what happened that October night. It was a cold night with that heavy humidity that seems to embrace you in the darkness. I was assigned to patrol an area on the outskirts of the city, an area known for its wooded areas and scattered houses, many of them abandoned. It is a place we prefer not to go if it is not necessary, but they had reported strange lights on one of the roads that crossed the forest. As usual, I assumed it would be some group of young people making a bonfire or, in the worst case, a homeless person looking for shelter. That night, I was alone in the patrol car. Sometimes I prefer to work like this. The silence and solitude allow me to concentrate. Although this time, I felt something different, an uneasiness that I could not shake from my chest. I left the city around 11 at night and entered the rural roads. The fog began to thicken, and I turned on the high beams and slowed down. The dense fog seemed to absorb the lights, leaving only a weak trail of clarity in front of me. The road was getting narrower, lined with tall trees whose branches seemed to lean almost intentionally towards the center of the road. Then I saw him in the distance. In the middle of the fog appeared the figure of an old man with his back turned. He was completely motionless, dressed in old and worn clothes, almost as if he had come from another time. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I did what protocol dictated. I stopped the patrol car, took the flashlight, and got out of the vehicle with the flashlight focused on the man's figure. I shouted to him in a firm voice, "Sir, identify yourself. You are on private property." The old man did not move. Only the wind whispered through the branches, and for a second, I thought he had not heard me. I took a couple of steps forward, repeating my warning, but suddenly, the old man began to walk slowly into the darkness, going deeper into the forest. What froze me was the silence. His steps did not make any sound. The crunch of the dry leaves under my boots were deafening, but he slid without breaking the stillness of the night. I increased my pace, trying to catch up with him, but every time I thought I was close, the figure would fade a little more into the fog. Anxiety began to tighten my chest, but my duty forced me to follow him. Something was not right. That was clear, and I could not let him get lost in the thicket without verifying his identity. However, as I advanced, the fog seemed to get denser, almost as if it closed around me. After several minutes of following him, the old man simply vanished. There was no warning or sound. 1 second he was there, and the next he was gone. I stood panting with the flashlight pointing at nothing. On the ground where I saw him for the last time, there was an old pocket watch with a broken chain and a rusty iron cross half buried in the ground. I picked them up without thinking, feeling a strange coldness in the objects. When I returned to the patrol, I felt disturbed, but I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I thought the old man was a homeless man who knew the area well and had found a way to disappear among the trees. However, something did not fit. The silence of his steps, his way of moving, the fog that seemed to follow. It all had an unnatural air. That night, I reported the incident on the radio and made a note of it in my report but omitted details. I didn't want them to think I had lost my mind, especially because I knew that no one would understand without having been there. I went home with the watch and the cross in my pocket, deciding to forget it, but the worst was just beginning. During the following days, my life changed. At work, I began to feel constantly watched, as if someone was always behind me, just a few steps away. But when I turned around, there was nothing. The nights in my house were worse. The clock that I had left on a table in my living room seemed to move by itself, changing position. The cross, although rusty, began to shine in the darkness, emitting a weak glow that I myself had verified over and over again that it was not a reflection of anything. One morning while I was at home, the alarm on my cell phone went off, but it was not a scheduled time. I got up confused and saw that the screen showed 3 in the morning. A current of cold ran through my body when, from the living room, I heard a slight check-tack. I had no clocks at home except the one I had found that night. I went to the living room with the phone flashlight shaking in my hand. The pocket watch was open, and its hand moved quickly as if time was moving too fast for it. When I looked up, I came across the figure of the old man. He was standing there in the darkness of my living room, staring at me. His eyes were empty, dark wells that seemed to swallow the light of the flashlight. Paralyzed, I barely managed to scream, but when I blinked, he was gone. For the next week, the apparitions continued, more and more disturbing. I began to see him in the windows, reflected in the mirrors of my house, and even in the patrol car, sitting in the back seat, always with my back, always in silence. My companions noticed my change. I stopped sleeping well, my face showed deep dark circles, and my body began to resent the lack of rest. But I could not tell them the truth. I did not want to be called crazy. The final revelation came one night when I arrived at the police station and found an old file on my desk, without knowing how it had gotten there. It contained newspaper clippings from more than 50 years ago, talking about an old man who disappeared in the same area where I had seen him, had been known as the Old Man of the Forest. They said he had died tragically in his burned-down house under mysterious circumstances, and that his body was never found. The pocket watch and the cross he had collected perfectly matched the description of his belongings. Desperate, I returned to the place where it all had begun. I felt that somehow I had to return those objects to free myself from the presence that was stalking me. The fog was even denser than that night, and the forest seemed like a labyrinth with no way out. I stopped at the exact point where I had lost sight of him the first time and left the watch and the cross on the ground. When I turned around, I felt his cold hand on my shoulder. I didn't move. I couldn't. He whispered something in my ear in a language I didn't understand, and then the pressure of his hand disappeared. I ran to the patrol car without looking back. My heart held it so tightly, I thought it would stop. Since that night, I have not seen him again. The watch disappeared from my house, and the cross, although I left it there, sometimes appears in my room, always in different places, as a reminder of what happened. I never patrolled that area again. Sometimes I wonder if I really managed to escape, or if I'm just waiting for it to come back. Every time the fog covers the city and the nights become too quiet, I'll never know what it really was that I saw, but I feel it every time I close my eyes, and sometimes when the wind blows hard, I think I hear its footsteps. Those that never made noise and a weak tea that keeps reminding me that there are things that should not be disturbed. My name is Leonardo, and what I'm going to tell you is something that I will never be able to forget. I have been a police officer for 15 years, and although I have lived through complicated situations, nothing prepared me for what happened that night. That hellish night that became a real nightmare. It was a cold and dark October night. There was a thick snow that enveloped the streets, almost as if the city wanted to hide something. My partner, Alvaro, and I were assigned to the night shift like so many other times. Despite the rumors about strange events in the area that we had to patrol, we had never paid too much attention. They were stories we believed, but that night, everything changed. We began our round at 10 o'clock. The air had a cutting cold that chilled us to the bone. The streets were deserted. Only the echo of our footsteps and the occasional headlight of some vehicle broke the silence. Our usual route included several alleys and abandoned commercial areas, places where normal people did not want to be after dark. Sometime around midnight, we received a call from the central office. A neighbor had reported strange noises coming from an old abandoned office building on Franklin Street, one of those places with history and not exactly good. It was said that years ago, a pharmaceutical company had carried out illegal experiments there, and that after a raid by the authorities, the building had been left empty, but the kind of emptiness that leaves marks and scars in the air. We headed to the place, the wheels of the patrol car cutting through the fog like a knife. When we arrived, we saw the building in question, an imposing and decaying structure with broken windows and graffiti covering its walls. We parked in front of the main entrance, feeling a chill that did not come from the weather. We armed ourselves and entered the building, our flashlights cutting through the interior darkness. The first floor was full of rubble and trash, a silent testimony to abandonment and oblivion. But what caught our attention was the absolute silence. It was as if the building was absorbing the sound, making even our whispers feel unreal. We climbed the main stairs, each creaking of metal echoing in the void. When we reached the second floor, a nauseating smell hit us hard. It was a stench of putrefaction mixed with something chemical, a smell that seemed to embed itself in our lungs. We advanced cautiously, walking through the long hallways full of empty offices until we reached a closed door at the end of the corridor. The doorknob was cold and sticky. Alvaro and I exchanged a look before he slowly opened the door. What we saw on the other side left us paralyzed. The room was an improvised laboratory, with tables full of jars and papers scattered everywhere. But the worst was what was in the center of the room. A human figure, or what was left of her, tied to a chair. Her skin was discolored, and her open, glassy eyes seemed to stare at us. We approached cautiously. The body was covered in scars and lacerations, as if it had been subjected to prolonged torture. Alvaro leaned down to examine it more closely while I kept guard. It was then that we heard the first noise, an almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I turned my flashlight towards the origin of the sound but saw nothing, only shadows moving with the light. Alvaro found a folder with documents on the table and began to read out loud. They were reports of experiments, descriptions of tests performed on human subjects. As the whispering grew louder, turning into a constant murmur that filled the room, we could hear loose words, fragments of sentences, as if many voices were speaking at once. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut, and the lights of our flashlights began to flicker. The murmur turned into screams, and from the shadows emerged spectral figures, distorted human forms that seemed to twist in agony. Alvaro and I backed away, trying to stay calm, but the situation was becoming more and more desperate. We tried to open the door, but it was stuck. The screams became unbearable, and the spectral figures began to surround us, slowly approaching. I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder, and a sharp pain ran through my body. I turned and saw one of those figures looking at me with empty eyes, its mouth open in a silent scream. Alvaro fired his gun, but the bullets seemed to go through the figures without causing them any harm. It was then that I remembered something I had read in a book about paranormal phenomena. These entities are often linked to specific objects, and destroying those objects can weaken them. I looked around desperately, searching for something that could be the anchor of these spirits. My gaze fell on the documents on the table, and without thinking twice, I picked them up and threw them into a metal container in the corner. I lit a match and threw it inside, watching as the flames consumed the papers. At the same time, the screams began to diminish, and the figures, the ghosts, retreated, slowly dissolving into the darkness. The door swung open, and Alvaro and I ran down the stairs as fast as we could. We didn't stop until we were outside the building, breathing in the cold night air with relief. We looked back and saw the dark and silent building, as if nothing had happened. But we knew that something terrible had happened there, something we could never forget. That night, when we returned to the police station, we didn't say anything to anyone about what we had seen. We knew that no one would believe us, that they would think we were crazy or that we had imagined everything. But we knew the truth. We knew that there are things in this world that cannot be explained. Things that lurk in the shadows and that can turn a quiet night into a hellish nightmare. Since then, I have never patrolled that area again. Every time I pass by that building, I feel a shiver run down my spine. The fog of that night has dissipated, but the memories are still alive. The nights on patrol were always the same, long and silent, filled with a monotony that was only broken by the occasional noise from the patrol radio. Sometimes, in the darkest hours, the wind whispered through the trees, creating an eerie symphony that accompanied our rounds. There was something almost comforting in that routine, a sense of normality in the midst of darkness. It was a night without a moon. The only light came from the scattered streetlights and the headlights of our patrol car. There was a strange sensation in the air, like an electrical charge that made the hairs on the nape of the neck stand on end. My partner and I had traveled that route countless times, a desolate stretch near the forest where the trees formed a natural tunnel that seemed to absorb the light. While we patrolled near the forest, we saw a small figure next to a tree. It was a little girl with her head down and her shoulders shaken from crying. We stopped immediately, both perplexed by the scene. Children are not usually alone in the middle of the night, especially in a place like that. We got out of the patrol car and approached her cautiously. I could feel my heart beating hard as the light from our flashlight illuminated her face. When she raised her head, she looked at us with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to absorb all the light around them. Before we could react, the girl disappeared into the thicket, as if she had vanished into thin air. We stood frozen for a moment, the silence of the forest becoming deafening. Finally, my partner broke the silence, suggesting that it could have been our imagination or some trick of the light. But we both knew that we had seen the same thing and that it had no logical explanation. Back at the station, we reported what had happened. We were expecting skepticism, perhaps some joke from our colleagues, but instead, there was a tense silence. The sergeant looked at us with a serious expression before going to a dusty filing cabinet. He pulled out an old folder and handed it to us. Inside was a series of yellow documents, reports from 30 years ago about the disappearance of a little girl in that same area. The photos showed a little girl with the same face we had seen that night. It was impossible, but it was there, documented and recorded. The following nights were more tense. Every shadow seemed to have a life of its own. Every creak in the forest made our hearts skip a beat. We continued our patrol, always alert, hoping to see the girl again. There was a feeling of unease that would not leave us, as if the forest was watching us. A week later, we received an unusual call. A group of campers had reported hearing crying near the same place where we saw the girl. We rushed to the site, finding a group of frightened people who described to us the same thing we had seen. It was obvious that something beyond our understanding was happening. We decided to investigate further, returning to the place during the day. We walked through the forest, following the trail that we thought might lead us to some clue. We found a clearing where the grass was strangely withered, and in the center, an ancient doll covered in dirt and moss. When I touched the doll, I felt an intense cold that ran through my body. Suddenly, we heard a whisper, a childish voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was a barely audible murmur, but enough to freeze the blood. Said our names over and over again. We decided to return immediately, feeling that we had disturbed something that should remain hidden. But as night fell, the voice followed us, whispering in the wind, creeping that the girl had been the victim of a horrible crime. Her body was never found, and the inhabitants of the town believed that her spirit remained trapped, looking for justice or simply peace. We decided to consult a medium, someone who could help us understand what was happening. The medium took us to the forest, to the same clearing where we found the doll, and performed a ritual, calling upon the spirit of the girl. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air filled with a palpable energy. The girl appeared again, this time more tangible, her face reflecting a deep sadness. With the medium's soft and reassuring voice, We learned that the girl had been murdered and buried somewhere nearby. With her help, we found her makeshift grave hidden under the roots of an old tree. It was a disturbing place, loaded with an inexplicable sadness. Finally, with the intervention of the medium, we were able to give her a proper burial. While we did so, I felt a strange calm, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. The girl was gone, and the forest regained its usual silence, but now it seemed less ominous. Despite everything, those nights marked us deeply. Every time we passed through that stretch of the forest, we remembered the empty gaze of the girl and the sadness she carried. Although her spirit finally found peace, the scars of that experience remain with us. Life on night patrol was never the same again. Now, every shadow and every whisper in the darkness reminds us that we are not alone, that there are presences that watch us from the shadows, waiting for someone to see them and remember them. Night on patrol. The night shift had a peculiarity that made even the most veteran among us stay alert. The city seemed to change, becoming a more hostile and mysterious place under the cover of darkness. There was something in those hours between midnight and dawn that brought out the worst in people and the city itself. That night, however, it was nothing to be different. An emergency call took us to a dark alley, and what we found there would change our lives forever. It was a cold night, and the fog swirled in the streets, creating ghostly figures that seemed to move with a life of their own. My partner and I responded to a call about a man asking for help in an alley. It was not unusual to receive strange calls, but something in the voice of the dispatcher and in the tone of the call put us on alert. We arrived at the place and got out of the car with our flashlights in hand. The alley was narrow and dirty, with high walls that blocked the light from the few streetlights nearby. We moved forward slowly, illuminating every dark corner, every pile of garbage, looking for any sign of the man who supposedly needed help. Suddenly, we saw a figure in the distance. It was a man, or at least it seemed to be one, standing next to a garbage container. He was staggering as if he was injured or disoriented. We approached cautiously, calling out to him and asking him to identify himself. We got no answer, only an inaudible murmur and the sound of his staggering steps. When we illuminated his face with the flashlight, we realized that he had no facial features, just a smooth, pale surface. It was like looking at a wax mask without any human detail. My hands began to shake, and my heart was pounding in my chest. The man, if he could be called that, stared at us, although without eyes. Then he simply disappeared into the fog before we could react. We ran from place to place, terrified, without looking back. The fear I felt that night was indescribable. There was no logic to what we had seen, no rational explanation that could calm my mind. We got to the car, and my partner, equally pale and shaking, tried to communicate what had happened over the radio, but the words would not come out, only white noise and static. We sat in silence for what seemed like an eternity, trying to catch our breath and compose ourselves. We decided that the best thing would be to return to the police station and report the incident, but the way back was equally disturbing. The streets, normally so familiar, seemed strange and unfamiliar. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, and the noises were amplified in the stillness of the night. When we finally arrived at the police station, we were met with worried and confused faces. We were not the only ones to experience something strange that night. Other patrolmen reported sightings of strange figures, unexplained lights, and voices that seemed to come from nowhere. It was as if the entire city was under some kind of curse. We tried to continue with our routine, but something had changed in us. The image of the Faceless Man haunted us, invading our thoughts and dreams. The feeling of that something was watching us from the darkness became constant, even during the day. The sunlight did not seem enough to dispel the shadows that had settled in our minds. Weeks went by, and despite our attempts to forget what had happened, the feeling of fear persisted. My colleagues and I began to notice small changes in our surroundings. Objects that moved from place, doors that slammed shut, and inaudible whispers in the stillness of the night. We knew it was not our imagination, but no one wanted to admit what we really feared. One night, during another patrol round, we received a similar call. Another alley, another man asking for help. My partner and I looked at each other. The fear reflected in his eyes was the same that I felt. However, we could not ignore the call. It was our duty to respond, despite the terror we felt. We arrived at the place and once again found a solitary figure in the darkness. This time, his back was to us. We advanced cautiously, illuminating the area with our flashlights. The man turned around and stopped our horror. We saw the same featureless face, or rather, the lack of them. We stepped back, ready to run, but something stopped us. An intense, paralyzing cold took hold of us. The faceless man raised a hand and pointed at something behind us. I slowly turned and saw a huge shadow approaching. It was not human, not quite. It looked like an amalgam of darkness and twisted shapes, advancing towards us with supernatural speed. I felt a pressure in my chest, as if something was squeezing my heart. We ran, but this time we could not escape. The shadow reached us, and I felt a sharp pain in my back, like invisible claws tearing me apart. My partner screamed, and then everything went black. I woke up at the police station in the infirmary. They told me that I had been found unconscious in the patrol car, alone, and with superficial wounds. There was no trace of my partner, as if he had vanished into thin air. The search that followed yielded no clue as to his whereabouts. The department tried to keep the incident a secret, claiming that it had been a case of extreme stress and hallucinations, but I knew the truth. I knew what we saw and experienced that night was real, and I knew something else was lurking in the shadows of the city, something we didn't understand and couldn't stop. Eventually, I left the force. I couldn't keep patrolling the same streets, knowing what I knew. The nights became unbearable, and the fear I felt wouldn't let me live in peace. I moved far away, to a place where the nights were less ominous, and where I hoped to find some peace. But even here, far from the city, the shadows follow me in my dreams. I see the faceless man and the shadow that took my partner. I hear whispers in the night and feel a presence that never leaves me in peace. I know I can never truly escape what I lived that night. Terror has become a part of me, a shadow that will follow me until the end of my days. If you like the stories, we would like you to support us with a like or a comment, as that would help us a lot. If you are not subscribed, we invite you to do so you do not miss the best of possessed stories of the night. Thank you for listening to us until the next story. My name is Javier, and I am a police officer in Lima. This is a story that I will never forget. It was October, one of those nights where the cold penetrates to the bones, and I was assigned a night shift at the district morgue. It was supposed to be a routine surveillance. In that area of the city, the theft of corpses and personal objects from the bodies was not something impossible to believe. The place was old, with cracked walls and a high ceiling that seemed to always be on the verge of collapsing. There was only a yellowish spotlight at the main entrance, illuminating barely a couple of meters around. The rest was a kingdom of shadows. The humidity and the smell of cheap disinfectant invaded the environment. The first hours passed without incident. Only the sound of my breathing and the rhythmic pounding of my boots against the worn floor keeping me company. Past 3 in the morning, the sound started. It was a weak murmur, barely something between a mumble and a laugh. I felt the hair on my neck stand up, but I tried to stay calm. "There's nothing here," I repeated to myself. I took my flashlight and pointed it towards the end of the long hallway that led to the main room of the morgue. Nothing moved, but the sound persisted as if the echo of a distant moan was resonating in the walls. I decided to ignore it, thinking it could be my mind playing tricks on me due to lack of sleep. A couple of hours later, when I was starting to relax again, something else happened. I heard the sound of a clearer, closer cry coming from the end of the hallway. I decided to find out what was going on. This is just work, I thought as I moved forward with my flashlight shaking in my hand. At the end of the hallway, I saw someone standing, a white, almost ethereal figure. It was a woman with her back to me, sobbing in a trembling voice. "Miss, you can't be here," I said in a firm voice, although I felt like fear was betraying me. The woman didn't respond. She didn't move. As I took a step towards her, I felt an unnatural cold. A humidity ran over my entire body that seemed to penetrate my clothes, down to the bones. I took a step closer, and the woman slowly turned. My flashlight trembled, the light illuminating her face, or at least where her face should be. She had no face, just an infinite darkness, a void that seemed to swallow all the light. My instinct was to back away, but my feet seemed glued to the ground. She raised a hand as if she wanted to reach me, and then she disappeared, fading like fog before my eyes. In that instant, the metal door of the morgue slammed shut with a bang that echoed throughout the building. The sound reverberated as if the walls were laughing at me. I don't know how long I remained motionless, with the flashlight still on, pointing at nothing. I finally gathered enough courage to back away towards the exit, my breathing labored and my hands shaking. When I turned towards the door to open it, it was locked. I hadn't locked it. I remembered clearly. I tried to open it with my key, but the lock seemed stuck as if something had blocked it from the inside. I was stuck in that morgue. I tried to use the radio to call for help, but it only emitted a static noise, deafening, a sound that seemed laughing at my desperation. It was at that moment when I heard the sound of something dragging itself along the floor behind me. I turned slowly and saw how one of the bodies on one of the metal stretchers was now on the floor, dragging its stiff legs towards me. The flashlight fell from my hand. The beam of light spun uncontrollably on the floor while I stepped back, not knowing what to do. The lights flickered. The smell of decomposition became unbearable, and then everything went silent. I picked up the flashlight with a trembling movement and pointed it at the stretcher. The body was back in its place as if it had never moved. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself that it was a product of tiredness from fear. This is not happening, I repeated over and over again. But I knew that something had changed in the environment. Something in that morgue was wrong, deeply wrong. I approached the door of the morgue, but before touching it, it opened by itself, letting in a freezing air. The temperature had dropped brutally. I could see my breath forming in small clouds of steam in the air. In the distance, in the dark hallway, I saw again the woman's faint, ghostly figure. She was not crying this time. She just looked at me as if waiting. I felt a pressure on my chest, a weight that prevented me from moving. My heart was beating uncontrollably so hard that I feared it would explode at any moment. Suddenly, the door of the morgue closed again, this time with such violence that I thought it would break. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. Time blurs in that place. Finally, in a moment of desperation, I hit the door with all my strength. It was then that the lock clicked, and I was able to open it. I ran towards the exit without looking back, feeling that something or someone was right behind me. Breathing in the first rays of dawn, my companions arrived shortly after, alarmed by my decomposed appearance. I told them what I had seen, but they did not believe me. They insisted that tiredness and suggestion had played a trick on me. But one of the officers, an older man with many years in the force, looked at me in silence with an expression that said more than his words could convey. After that night, I was never the same. The shadows seemed to haunt me, and the nights became an endless torment. My colleagues say that the district morgue has its own story. They say that many years ago, a woman dressed in white was found dead in the place, abandoned by her husband after a failed abortion. Since then, some assure that her spirit has never stopped wandering, looking for something or someone. I tried to forget and leave it behind,